So what we're here to talk about today, and why are we here to talk about it? So it's the EU ETS we're here to talk about, which is the EU emission trading system. In our previous webinar, which is free to view as a recording, we focused on the IMO targets and what the IMO is doing to address this globally. There's two methods used for that, which we'll not spend much time on, but that's the EEXI, which is the Energy Efficiency Existing Ship Index, which is basically a mechanical change to your vessel, whether it's power limitation, shaft limitation, or some form of energy saving device such as Mewis duct or some design like that. Then the other part of the focus in the IMO's reduction is the CII, which is the carbon intensity indicator. And this is more operational changes focused around such things as just-in-time shipping, port arrivals, etc., etc. So it focuses more on the operational changes. But we're not here to talk about that today. We're here to talk about the IMO's targets and the EU targets and how they compare and how they're different sides of the spectrum effectively. So let's look at this graph first of all. And what we want to show you here, as you can see as we go up here, this is the UNCTAD seaborne trade reference line here. And we can see up to the point of around 2008, that trade actually increased at a similar pace to the CO2 emissions, as we can see on the y-axis up here. This obviously kept on increasing, and then the emissions slightly leveled off to a point. Now, what the IMO's targets are is to reduce the greenhouse gases, GHG emissions, by 50% when compared to 2008. And for your reference as well, the 2008 EEOI, which is the Energy Efficiency Operational Indicator, also comes in at around this level as well. So the target is to reduce by 50% compared to the 2008 levels, which we can see equates to around here on the graph. And the aim is to reach here by 2050. So this is quite a steady decline, as you can see, and it's not too dissimilar to the increase that we've shown on the left-hand side of this graph. So you can see it's not really that big a target. It's not really that stringent a decrease. And there has been, for those that follow you within the maritime press, there has been talk of perhaps it's not enough. So let's look at the other side of the spectrum now, as we say, and let's look at the EU and what the EU is aiming to do here and how stringent their targets are and how that's going to compare. So first of all, the Fit for 55 is something we want to highlight here and something you're going to see listed more and more as we go throughout the next few years. And why is it called Fit for 55? Well, we show you here that it's a Fit for 55. It's a policy to reduce GHG emissions by at least 55% by 2030 compared to 1990. And this is in line with the Green Deal and the Paris Agreement. And the aim is, the EU aims to be the world's first climate neutral continent by 2050. In comparison, we can see the IMO targets, as we've just discussed in the previous slide, aren't quite so stringent. And, by 2050, the aim is to reduce the total GHG emissions by 50%. Now, you'll see quite a bit interchanged GHG and CO2 throughout when you look at any topics in this area. But just to give you a little bit of background on that, carbon dioxide is the primary greenhouse gas, and according to the IPCC, which is the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, it's between 76 and 80% that carbon dioxide represents of CO2, of greenhouse gas emissions. So we just look at the next slide here, and what we're doing here is we're comparing the IMO, the EU targets and the IMO targets. And you can see here, as we look at the timeline, the date going across here, and we look at the CO2 emissions up on the y-axis, we can see it's a lot more of a stringent reduction compared to the IMO targets. As we suggested earlier, some in the industry are stating that the IMO targets aren't that ambitious. And from a personal point of view, it would probably be good to see somewhere in between for both. It would make it a lot easier, but that's not what we're going to get here. We're going to have a different trajectory with the EU targets and different methods of doing so. So let's look at the recent methods that have been brought to the forefront here. Could somebody just mute their microphone? Thank you. So we've got the Fit for 55 maritime bunker proposals. So we've got the Energy Tax Directive, ETD. And to update the ETD focuses on two areas. There's two areas of focus here, which has been recently announced on July the 14th, and that's a new structure of tax rates based on energy content and environmental performance of fuels and electricity. So it's a tax structure to account for that. And then the other point is to broaden the taxable base by including more products and reducing exemptions on heavy fuel for intra-EU voyages in the EU. So that's what the Energy Tax Directive looks at and what we'll work to do. Then the next point we bring to point here is the Alternative Fuels Infrastructure, AFI. And this sets out requirements for suitable bunkering infrastructure such as LNG before 2025 and shoreside electrical power before 2030. Obviously, that's in the interest of everybody, economies of scale, if you can plug into your shore power when you're ashore, and then it prevents pollution in localized areas. Then the other area is the Fuel EU Maritime, and this initiative aims to increase the production and use of sustainable, low-carbon alternative fuels with increasingly strict limits on greenhouse gas intensity, which will apply from 2025 onwards. And this will look at it on a well-to-wake analysis basis in a little bit more detail and a fairer comparison. And then the next point, which we'll move on to lastly before we move on to the next part of the presentation, is the recently amended EU ETS. The EU ETS emissions trading system puts a price on carbon and lowers the cap on emissions from certain economic sectors every year. It is believed that there's been a 43% reduction, 42.8% reduction in emissions for power generation energy intensity for the last 16 years in the industry. And from 2023, it's set to include certain ships over 5,000 GT. It's important to note that there's a review clause built into this as we go through the next period so that it can meet up and match with certain other guidelines and regulations out there, for example, the IMO. So with that, moving on to the ETS, I'm going to hand over to Alvin, who's going to elaborate on this a little bit more. So Alvin, if you take control there, the floor is yours. Thank you.
All right. Thanks, Mark. Yeah, just a way of a quick introduction. My name is Alvin Forster. I'm a loss prevention executive here at North. Qualified chief engineer, ex-seagoing engineer, been a superintendent, surveyor, and been at North for over 10 years now. Coming on to the subject in hand, in July, the EU published their proposals on this, a 518-page document full of a proposed amended regulation and impact assessments. So I'm going to try and summarize it here in 5 minutes. So wish me luck. So the EU's emission trading system, it's essentially a carbon trading scheme. It's currently the world's largest. It's been around for about 16 years. It's starting off about 2005. It focused really on the European energy sector and the manufacturing industries, and covering road transport and then aviation. And the reason why we're all here today is because of the recent developments where a revised ETS has been proposed. And the headline is that shipping is going to be included. And it's proposed that these amendments will take effect in 2023. But as I think we'll hear from Simon later, that this might be a bit optimistic, but that is the aim. The EU ETS, it works on a cap and trade principle. So quite simply, a cap is set on the total amount of greenhouse gases that are allowed to be emitted. And the EU creates these permits or allowances for each unit of emissions allowed under that cap. And the cap is reduced over time, so the theory is that the total emissions will fall. In its current form, the EU ETS puts a price on every tonne of CO2 emitted, which is determined by the market, so it is going to fluctuate. These carbon credits are called EU allowances, EUA, and these are purchased by the emitter, which in our case is going to be the ship owner, ship operator. These are purchased usually at an auction on trading platforms like the ICE, which is the Intercontinental Exchange, or the EEX, which is the European Exchange. In some industries, these allowances have been allocated for free. It's usually allocated for free as an incentive for using low carbon technologies, or to prevent what's known as carbon leakage, which is a means to stop companies and industries moving out of the region to try and avoid it. But my understanding is that in the maritime sector, free allowances won't be given per se, but there is an alternative phased-in approach, which we're going to come to later. So each year, each emitter will surrender the required number of allowances to cover its CO2 emissions for that previous year. And if they fail to surrender those allowances, it can lead to heavy financial penalties. And if you fail to surrender for 2 years in a row, then you could be looking at expulsion from EU ports. So it's pretty heavy. The current ETS for the other industries generally works on the principle that if you've got any allowances left over, then you can keep them for future use or sell them on that carbon trading market. This option to sell leftover allowances, I don't think it's going to apply to shipping during this phase-in period, which again we'll come to pretty soon. So under the EU plan, shipping will be added to the EU ETS on a gradual basis from 2023, when the ship owner is going to have to surrender enough allowances to cover 20% of their total emissions of applicable voyages. This is expected to rise to 45% in 2014, 70% in 2025. Then from 2026, ship owners will have to cover 100% of your emissions or applicable emissions under this scheme. Excuse me. The EU ETS is going to be aligned with the existing EU MRV regulation. And that's the regulation that requires shipping companies to monitor, report, and have verified your voyage data, where vessels or vessels in your fleet have traded to, from, or within EU or EEA countries. So the scheme is going to apply to cargo vessels and passenger vessels that are 5,000 GT and over, same as the MRV. So vessels like dredgers, fishing vessels, offshore support vessels, where you don't work cargo or carry passengers, are going to be excluded. And this comprises emissions from your main engines, your auxiliary engines, and your boilers. And importantly, this includes ballast voyages and your time within an EU port. So you might already know that the EU MRV requires the ship owner to report several parameters, such as your fuel consumptions, the amount of cargo carried, distance travelled, and the time spent both at sea and in port. But the ETS only wants you to calculate the amount of CO2 emitted during those applicable periods. So this is calculated by multiplying your fuel consumption by the emission factor for that fossil fuel that was used. It doesn't take into consideration how much cargo was carried. And let's finish off here very quickly. A voyage under the ETS is berth to berth between two ports of call where the vessel has loaded or discharged cargo, or in the case of passenger ships, embarked or disembarked passengers. The proposed solution for voyages that start or finish outside an EU or EEA port is to consider 50% of those emissions. And when at berth at an EU port or an intra-EU voyage, 100% of the emissions are considered. And with that, I'll pass you on to Helen, if you want to take control.
Thanks, Alvin. There we go. Good morning, everyone. I'm Helen Barden, a senior solicitor in the FD&D team at North in the Newcastle office. I work predominantly with European and American members, but I'm on the cross-departmental decarbonisation working group with Alvin and Mark and some of my other colleagues as well. And we have started getting quite a few inquiries from members about the EU ETS proposal and how that might affect them and how it could be dealt with in charter parties. So that's what I'm going to have a look at now. So the proposed amendments to the EU ETS, which include the extension of the EU ETS to account for shipping emissions, will need to be achieved ultimately through legislative instruments at EU level. So the proposed amendments therefore do still need the approval of the European Parliament and the EU Council before becoming EU law. The final directive is then going to need to be implemented by the individual member states at national level. And Simon, as Alvin mentioned before, will give his view on the likely timeframe for implementation shortly. But due to the stages of agreement yet to be completed, it's possible that the proposal may be changed or may be delayed. But if we assume that the proposed amendments remain unchanged, then, or at least materially unchanged, then the onus will rest on the party described as the shipping company to comply with the EU ETS. So as set out on this slide, the EU ETS proposal describes the shipping company to mean the ship owner or any other organisation or person, such as the manager or bareboat charterer, that has assumed the responsibility for the operation of the ship from the ship owner, and that, on assuming such responsibility, has agreed to take over all the duties and responsibilities imposed by the International Management Code for the safe operation of ships and for pollution prevention. So, as you'll see, the responsibility for compliance is on the owners, or if that vessel is chartered out on a bareboat charter, then it's likely to be the bareboat charterers who will have assumed the responsibility under the ISM code. That said, given that it's the charterer's use of the vessel that determines where the vessel trades, it's understandable that owners or bareboat charterers are likely going to want to pass down the cost of compliance onto their charterers. So just looking at this slide, how can a shipping company, most likely the owners, pass their liability onto the charterers? Well, the EU ETS proposal states within it that, in line with the polluter pays principle, the shipping company could, by means of a contractual arrangement, hold the entity that is directly responsible for the decisions affecting the CO2 emissions of the ship accountable for the compliance costs under this directive. This entity would normally be the entity that is responsible for the choice of fuel, route, and speed of the ship. So, while the directive places the primary responsibility on the shipping company, it seems to expect that liability will ultimately be passed down the charter chain, given that it's usually the charterer who issues the employment and voyage orders to the ship, and in the case of a time charterer, the party who is responsible for the provision of the fuel. The way in which the owners may want to ascertain a charterer's liability may vary depending on the type of charter party. So if the charter party is a voyage charter, then the price could be a carbon included price, or alternatively there could be a provision included in the charter party to pass the cost of allowances down onto the charterers. In the case of a time charter, whether it's going to be dealt with on a voyage by voyage basis or, for example, annually in the context of a longer term time charter, that'll be for the parties to negotiate. In terms of trying to pass the liability onto the charterers following completion of a voyage that incorporates the EU ETS, whether that's going to be done prior to the emissions data being verified and the EU ETS liability to surrender the allowances actually falling due, it might be necessary to include an emission calculation within the charter party itself. For example, as Alvin mentioned, to include the fuel consumption and emission factor in the charter party, along with a carbon price trading platform reference, such as the EEX or the ICE, to provide for that allowance price. However, as I believe Simon will discuss later, there is volatility with the carbon price. And so obviously settling a sum with the charterers in advance of the ultimate liability falling due could lead to the owners potentially paying more or less down the line. Finally, I'm just going to quickly mention the penalties, which Alvin also briefly touched upon before. So in the event that the shipping company doesn't surrender sufficient allowances, the penalties provided for in the EU ETS proposal include name and shame. So the names of the shipping companies in breach of the EU ETS will be published, which will obviously lead to reputational damage. There is a penalty for payment of excess emissions. And there is also the chance of an expulsion order where the shipping company does not comply for 2 consecutive periods, meaning that the entry into EU ports for all of the ships owned by that shipping company could be denied. These are obviously quite serious implications where there's a breach of the EU ETS. And so it may be that, for example, a charterer might want to obtain a warranty from the owners when entering into a charter party that the owners have complied with their obligations and requirements up to that point. Obviously, whether there might be any other provisions within a charter party dealing with non-compliance during the terms of that charter will be for the parties to ultimately agree on. So now I'm going to pass over to Edwin to discuss the quality of the data submitted and the importance of avoiding errors.
Thank you, Helen. Good morning, good day, good afternoon, good evening to everybody. I'm Edwin Pang, and I'm a naval architect and founder of a small specialist consultancy, Auxilia, working to bring real-world experience to regulatory policy development. And we work with many of the shipowner organizations, including ICS, WSD, Intertanko, Interferry, CLIA, as well as IX members, the IMO and the European Commission. And I also chair the IMO committee of the Royal Institution of Naval Architects, and I currently help to coordinate the IMO correspondence group developing CII technical guidelines. We're going to get practical in this very short presentation about what you can do to prepare. And this is around data quality and data that you submit. We've heard earlier that ETS is going to be based on the information you submit to MRV. So today, ships collect a variety of fuel data via BDN, flow meters, tank soundings, and other voyage data, such as distance traveled. And they're transmitted to shore, either bulk data or average over noon reports or email attachments. And then they're manually aggregated into 2 similar but separate schemes, IMO DCS and EU MRV. And then they're submitted to the verifier for checking. Now, there's a lot of manual input, manual collection, manual aggregation, and then there's further confusion between the 2 schemes, even sometimes at the verifier level. This is not intentional, just a consequence of the way some of these systems are set up. And today, there's no consequence if the data you submit isn't correct. So because nobody pays much attention, because it doesn't matter. If the data is right or wrong, it's just some data that is in a database somewhere, and it has no impact on your shipping operations. So in theory, there are lots and lots and lots of errors for lots of opportunities for errors, so really genuine errors and sort of intentional errors. What does that mean in practice? Well, the MRV database, the 2018 data, there are 259 versions, and 2019 had 189 versions, and the data from 2020, I think as of today, there are 50 versions. What this means is that after all the data has been submitted for verification, errors were found after the fact, and the verifiers or the shipping companies have gone back to make amendments. Now, there are lots of basic errors. So if you troll through it, there's excessive and implausible fuel consumption, distance traveled, etc. Many of them look like typos, data entry errors. That's the most common one. But even after all these revisions, there's still many errors if you know what you're looking for. And more difficult to find are errors that are not outliers, that don't sort of stick out like a sore thumb. So, and ship owners even report that sometimes the data held in MRV doesn't actually resemble what they thought they submitted. For those at least they have checked. Now here's just a very random example, and although it doesn't, it's not about fuel consumption, but this is EEDI. So EEDI, those of you who know, it's certified by the Class Society. You have an EEDI technical file, and really for sister ships, they should be broadly similar. And you can see they're all broadly similar, except for these 2, for whatever reason. This one, vessel number 8 in this series of sister ships, had an extraordinarily poor EEDI, and this one had an extraordinarily good EEDI. And this is very likely a typo. And if we looked at the numbers, you could see that it was obviously a typo, but this creeps in all over the place. What can you do about it? Well, regardless of what kind of ETS we get, because there'll be now lots of discussions about the final form of what ETS will look like, it is now time to get your reporting systems, processes, and resources in order. Also, as well for implementation of the CII framework at the IMO. And don't assume you can simply outsource to your verifier. So GHG reporting is becoming a core function in shipping companies, both for compliance, but also for clients needing to report and demonstrate Scope 3. And you need certainty, as you're going to have to buy enough allowances to cover your emissions. So get it right. So it's now time to pay attention to data quality. Thank you. I'm going to pass it back to Mark, I think.
Thank you, Edwin. Thank you. And then we will move on to Simon. If Simon would like to start your part of the presentation, please. Thank you. You're on mute, Simon, if you could just unmute.
Thank you very much for the invitation. So I'm from the International Chamber of Shipping. We're the global trade association for ship owners. Our membership is the world's national ship owners associations, and most of our work is representing the industry at the IMO, and in particular at the moment on the very complicated greenhouse gas negotiations. Next slide, please. I'll just really like to, in order to help stimulate the discussion, I'd just like to raise a few general points. Firstly, the position of ICS is that we do support carbon pricing. We see it as necessary to close the price gap between the zero carbon fuels of the future and conventional fuels, and really to help speed up the transition. However, when it comes to the proposals to extend the emissions trading to shipping, we are completely opposed. We strongly object to what's really a unilateral proposal to apply extraterritorial regulations to international shipping. Above all, this is going to undermine the negotiations at the IMO. And we know, talking to non-EU member states, that they are extremely upset about this and intend to raise their concerns at the next MEPC meeting this November. But more fundamentally, across the industry, we are opposed to ETS because we would like to have a simple global fuel levy. ETS has lots of uncertainties because you don't know what the carbon price is going to be. The price is very volatile. It's extremely difficult, complicated to pass on the cost down the supply chain. But in the longer term, it makes it more complicated to make those investment decisions about investing in zero carbon ships and new technologies. And then just to emphasize our commitment to carbon pricing, ICS with Intercargo just last week, we made a comprehensive proposal to IMO setting out how a global fuel levy could work across the global industry. Next point quickly, lightly trading, cost of trading under the EU ETS. The difficulty is ultimately we don't know what the carbon price is going to be because it's set by the market. At the moment, the EU carbon price is about 60 euros. 2-3 years ago, it was only 5 euros. So who knows what it's going to be in 5 or 10 years' time. But we anticipate it's going to increase quite considerably. But based on the current carbon price for the international voyages, if the carbon price is 60 euros a tonne, that would translate into approximately just over $200 per tonne of fuel. For international voyages, the EU will only charge you for half of that, but its hope is that other countries, whether it's the US or China, would charge you for allowances for the other half of the voyage. I've already mentioned how we are really concerned that this unilateral proposal is going to undermine the IMO negotiations. And above all, it's a distraction, because IMO does now have a plan to develop market-based measures. Interests such as ourselves and also the Pacific Island states have come up with very detailed proposals now for how a global fuel levy system might work. And then you have to remember that the EU proposals, even if they go ahead, they will only actually cover around about 10% of the world's global emissions. And so what's at risk is everything that's to play for with the reducing the rest of the world's emissions. Then I do want to emphasize that everything is still to play for. It has to be understood that at the moment this is still a proposal from the European Commission. It's got to go through the negotiating process with EU member states and also the Parliament. And then there will indeed be pressure from governments like China and India and others for the EU to amend its proposals. So although the Commission want the ETS to be implemented by 2023, these negotiations are probably not going to be completed until the end of next year. But then it all has to be transposed into all of the 27 EU states' national law. So it's not inconceivable that we'll actually be looking at 2025 by the time this is fully implemented, and it could go through quite considerable change as a result of the negotiating process. So our focus in ICS and at the global industry is to continue the negotiations at IMO, because we're a global industry and we need a global solution. Otherwise, we're going to have chaos. Yeah, I hope that was helpful. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thanks a lot, Simon. Very interesting, and it's good to see a different viewpoint on this. So now we're going to hand over to the next part of the presentation. So first of all, just before we carry on to the next part of the presentation, we just want to show you our signals articles effectively, which cover a lot of the points that are raised today, you know, and if you're ever unsure, keep an eye out for this. You can take a picture of the QR code here and it'll automatically take you to the section. Obviously from North, myself, Alvin and Helen writing these articles, and perhaps we can persuade Simon and Edwin to put pen to paper one day to write an article for us too. But yeah, it's worth keeping an eye out in this section. It's a useful data, information and exchange. So it's worth keeping an eye on this. So the next part of the presentation is really what you wanted to hear, what the audience wanted to hear. And that's what's really good about these webinars. During the registration process, we asked a series of questions. We said, does anybody want to ask any questions? And we received quite a few questions, which is good. There's also a couple of questions came into the chat as we're speaking. I haven't had a chance to look at them in detail, but if anybody wants to talk about any of the answers to any of those questions during their part of the next part of the presentation, then please feel free to do so. If not, we'll ensure to follow up afterwards with any answers to any questions. And as we said before, there'll be recording available and slides as well, and you can always contact us at any time. So with that, we'll then head into the interactive part of the presentation, and we're going to ask the questions. We're going to talk about the questions and give some answers to the questions that we've been asked. So for this part of the presentation, if the other panelists could please open up their videos, so we'll just have all 5 of us on the screen, please. Thank you. And then we'll try to remember and spotlight the person who's speaking first of all. So one of the first questions we received was, are there any exemptions or periods of exclusion, e.g. weighting fuel consumption at anchorage, reefer consumption, auxiliary engine consumption, etc. And as far as we're aware, there is nothing to exclude those periods. You know, it's in the interest to reduce emissions at all times, and it would be very hard to cross-calculate reefer consumption on certain types of vessels as well. So as far as we're aware, there's no exemptions there. One of the next questions we got asked, and we get asked quite a bit, it's hard to give an answer at this moment in time, but is to do with the P&I coverage against any of this. Now, the EU ETS is quite operational in essence, effectively. So the only time that the rules it'll be within the rules of the framework of North's framework, and it'll be handled in a similar manner to a MARPOL pollution fine if it may be handled in that way, and this would be at best discretionary. But this may be subject to review, and it's something that will be followed up on at a later stage. We can discuss that if it's reviewed at a later stage. The next question we had was on vessel sailing in ballast ports, basically. So a vessel which sails from a ballast port to an EU port, and the way the system works effectively, it was discussed a little bit before, but basically half of the emissions from ships performing voyages arriving in an EU port from a non-EU port, and half of the emissions from ships performing voyages departing from an EU port and arriving at a non-EU port. So emissions from ships performing voyages between EU ports and emissions at berth in EU ports are there as well. So an example of this would be, for example, that you have a vessel which is sailing in ballast from Seattle, let's say, to Rotterdam, and the in ballast voyage to pick up the cargo would mean that 50% of the emissions would be applicable to the EU ETS. And Edwin's going to go into a little bit more detail on this, a little bit more of a complex scenario that we posted to Edwin, so he will further that conversation later. Sorry. The next question was on biofuels, and yet again, Edwin's going to go into this in a little bit more detail, but the question on biofuels was how are biofuels handled, and our understanding at this moment in time, and Edwin will hopefully support us on this, is that they're considered a zero carbon fuel as things stand at this moment in time. There's probably going to be quite a demand for biofuels as we move through the next period. Obviously, for ship owners, it's very easy to use biofuels without any major technical changes to the engine, so it suits older tonnage, and it's something we're definitely going to see more of. But we'll go into that in further detail. Edwin will expand on that because he has exposure to these particular aspects more than ourselves. So with that, I'm going to hand over to Edwin, and I'm just going to give Edwin a recap of the questions to ask Edwin. So the first question, Edwin, and apologies, it's a little bit complicated, but it's, if we consider a voyage to from a non-EU country to an EU member state, what happens if the vessel calls at another non-EU country on the way to part load or part discharge the intermediate port, and does that reset the clock effectively? Or is it a case of as long as the cargo was first loaded, etc.? The next question, Edwin, or would you rather I just give you one question at a time?
It's all right. It's all right, Mark. I've got all the questions up in front of me, so I can answer them in sequence. So yeah, thanks for that. And actually, there was another question in the chat, effectively asking from Dimitra Constantino, 50% split in extra EU voyages might not be fair. Is there a proposal for more fair split of emissions? So the first thing before I go into the detail is we must stress that these are proposals that are now going to be discussed and negotiated through the Council and the Parliament. And so there will be some disagreements probably between the environmental and the transport committees. And what this finally looks like is possibly or very likely going to be very different. So what we say now may not even apply in 2 years' time, but this is our understanding for as the regulation is drafted today. So the question is, if you have a voyage and you have an intermediate port where you part load and part discharge, then according to how voyages are defined in the MRV regulation, then yes, if you have discharged or taken up cargo in this intermediate port, you reset the clock. If it's a technical stop, you took on some bunkers and you did a crew change, then no, you don't, because that's not cargo unless you're a passenger ship. So this is the current situation, and regarding the 50% split, this is again the proposal. Obviously, there are also many other governments around the world, as Simon has alluded to, are very, very upset with the EU about this, and so what it will look like eventually, whether it will remain 50% is at this stage unknown. The next question that was in the list was, ETS is fleet specific and MRV is vessel specific. Will this cause confusion with respect to transparency? I think this derives from the understanding that shipping companies need to purchase and surrender ETS allowances for all reported CO2 emissions, while MRV is reported on a per ship basis. Now, I'd assume that surrendered ETS allowances would cover the sum of all your reported CO2 on a per ship basis. So really, there shouldn't be any confusion. The only point where things get complicated is where the vessels are bought and sold and there's a change of company and you need to make sure your reporting is up to date and so on. So I think, and whoever asked that question, if you want to clarify your question, please feel free to do so in the chat. Biofuels. So there were a couple of questions on biofuels, and this one is probably slightly more specific. Is there a reduced emission factor for blends of fossil fuel and biofuel? And if so, where is this listed? Now, biofuels is one of these slightly gray areas in the MRV. So if you are, if your biofuel is certified sustainable in a number of the various certification schemes available that the EU accepts, then according to IPCC accounting guidelines, the biofuel can be considered to have a carbon factor of 0. It doesn't mean that all biofuels meet the standard and all biofuels meet this requirement. But because there's such a large variety of biofuels, as well as a large variety of production pathways, the emission factors are not listed anywhere. The only place they are kind of listed are in Annex 2 of the Fuel EU Maritime proposal, which is proposal 2021/0210, but it's not listed within MRV ETS. So, and current practice within MRV seems to be that biofuels and associated blends are appropriately recognized and only on a case-by-case basis. So if you use biofuel, for example, good fuels, then it is very likely that you will have a discussion with the verifier and then ensure that this ends up with a CF of 0. But this is not necessarily the case. And if you have further questions on biofuels, again, please feel free to ask in the chat. I think the next question is for Alvin, so I'll hand back over.
Yeah, thanks, Edwin. Yeah, I think it's the question is basically on carbon trading trends and how the EU ETS will integrate with other industries. And I think the answer's more or less being given anyway, is that the EU acted unilaterally on this, and even though the EU make noises saying that they have they do work with other companies on developing their trading systems, I think it's only the Swiss one, the Swiss model that they work in harmony with, I understand, which isn't really applies to shipping. So it's really it's all a bit of an unknown, to be honest, on how it's going to integrate with other systems around the world, I'm afraid. While I'm on, just to clarify a question that came on about selling any excess allowances on the open market. The legislation doesn't prevent that at all, from what I can see. So if you've got excess allowances, you should be able to sell them on the open market. What the legislation does say is that while, say, in 2023, you only have to surrender 20% of the allowances, those remaining 80% of allowances won't be available on the market. So that's the EU making them allowances available for trading. But I would envisage that if you're going through a phased approach where if you've got any excess allowances and the next year you have to submit even more because of that phased-in approach, I suppose it's a decision that would have to be made at the time whether or not you want to sell them or keep them till the next year. So again, that's a bit of hedging and working the carbon trade market. So I think if I'll allow Simon and Edwin to jump in there to put me right on these matters, because it's pretty complicated. Yeah. We've got one final question. How's the payment going to be made for carbon credits? It's on the ICE and EX carbon trading platforms. It's all done by auction. So although I've never tried it myself, it seems quite straightforward to buy your allowances. Auctions are generally, depending on the platform, generally about once a week, twice a week. And I think that's all the questions that were allocated to me. I think there's been a bit of discussion there about the identity of the shipping company and how to identify them. I don't know, Helen, if you can say any more on that.
Yeah, I think the way in which the shipping company will be identified will be as per the definition, but I think the issue is, I suppose, if there is potentially a change in that during the reporting period, then that would need to be carefully dealt with. The intention is, under the proposal, that each company will have an administering authority, which will be one of the member states. So they'll be allocated a particular member state who will deal with the company. So if there is any liability due, then it will be the designated administering authority that will enforce that. I know there's been a question in terms of how, whether there would be a right in international waters, for example, to claim as a legal basis for claiming. The liability is caught by nature of the fact that the vessel trades to the EU, and it's under the EU law, or will be once, subject to no changes, or as the proposal ends up, and once it's implemented into EU law. That's how the liability will catch the shipping company. So I think that probably deals with that. I don't know if there's any other. I think there was one other question for me, Mark. I don't know if you want me to deal with it now.
Yeah, please. Yeah, that'd be great, Helen. Yeah, while you're on that, please. Yeah.
So one question that had come in was whether we had seen any draft clauses that we thought would successfully pass the EU ETS liability from an owner down to their charterer, subject to the proposal staying as drafted. And we have had clauses come in from a number of members querying whether they will successfully pass the cost of allowances down to the charterers. It's clear that there's obviously quite a wide range of draft clauses out there that may try and deal with this. And it's obviously very important to look at the specific wording of the clause itself, so that it might be, just a few words missing in a clause that would stop the liability potentially being passed down. So, for example, if the word carbon tax isn't sufficiently defined, isn't wide enough, then it might not catch the EU ETS system. Another point just to note is that while under time charter parties, there's usually the attempt to redeliver from one charter and deliver into the next charter as close as possible. I suppose there could be a risk under voyage charters that for the ballast voyage to the load port, on the basis that the delivery to the charter is at the load port, there could be the allowance cost resting with the owners if there's not provision that is sufficiently wide enough within that voyage charter party, and whether that would be something that a voyage charter would take on anyway. I don't know the answer to that. That's a very commercial point. We've obviously also seen more widely drafted clauses that aren't just to cater for the EU ETS, that are to try and deal with any potential emission trading schemes or carbon levies that might be introduced. It's obviously difficult to draft for the unknown, but we are aware that some members are trying to do that as best possible. But obviously, if anybody has any queries on clauses, then you can feel free to get in touch with me or your usual FD&D contact, and we'll be happy to help. Thanks, Mark.
Okay, thank you very much, Alan. That's great. So I'm just gonna, the next set of questions are for Simon. So I'm just gonna spotlight Simon, and I'm just gonna read the questions to Simon, and then I'll just move the spotlight from Helen now. So yeah, Simon, the next question's for you, really. The first one is the implementation of the regulation. You know, our thoughts are perhaps that it may be, you know, it may be not too far into the future, but would appreciate your thoughts on that, please. The next question is, will we see other regions in the world carry out a similar exercise? And then the other one is just on the creation of transshipment hubs outside EU waters. And that's the last question for you there, Simon.
Yeah, thank you. Yeah, so when it comes to the implementation dates, just to reiterate, no one can know for sure. The Commission want this implemented by 2023. But as I said, this is going to be a very complex negotiation with the EU member states plus the Parliament. And you have to remember this is part of a much, much bigger package affecting the whole EU economy. And many of the other non-maritime related bits are also very controversial. So it could take some time for that process to be complete, and then it's all got to be transposed into national legislation. On the other hand, it's important to understand that this is part of the EU Green Deal, and this is the EU's political showcase initiative for the next decade. So the Commission are going to be throwing everything they can, pulling every lever they can to make this move forward as quickly as possible. But it's not my view, it's what my colleagues in Europe tell me, that they think it's probably quite optimistic of the Commission to think that this is going to be in place by 2023, but who can tell? When it comes, of course, when it comes to what other nations are going to do, of course, the European Commission's hope is that, even though they've gone unilateral, they hope that other trading blocs, whether it's the United States or China, will introduce similar measures and cover the other 50% of the international voyage. Again, very hard to tell without giving an detailed analysis of the US political situation. Frankly, the Biden administration, it's absolutely chaotic. No one knows what their position is. And then they've got a very difficult balance in Congress at the moment. So the idea, the notion that they could introduce ETS to shipping, we will have to see. With China, interestingly, there's lots of rumours that China plans to apply ETS to international shipping. But the Chinese authorities tell us that they have no intention to do so, and they are absolutely furious about the Europeans going unilateral. And I don't want to promote conspiracy theories, but I can't help thinking that some European interests are promoting the view that China is ready to move with a similar ETS for international shipping going into China. But we will see. But then this really flows into the last question, which is about, I think it really relates to carbon leakage. I mean, the whole problem with a unilateral approach is that there's lots of scope for ship operators, quite reasonably, to change their trading patterns. So why trade into Europe when you can trade Tangier outside the EU, expanding its port, and do the transshipment from there? And I mean, I despair equally at my private view is I despair at the position of the United Kingdom. I mean, the whole point of Brexit, as I understood it, was to have an independent position from the EU. But they seem to want to continue with applying the ETS to shipping, whereas I would have thought, I don't represent British shipping or British ports, but I would have thought this would be a wonderful opportunity for the UK to actually attract shipping to the UK by remaining outside of the ETS. But likewise, every statement, I mean, it seems to be totally chaotic statements coming out of the UK government at the moment with respect to shipping, as we saw over the weekend with this very bizarre statement from Grant Shapps about absolute zero by 2050 and how we're meant to be achieving that. Yeah, but there's lots of unknowns, and I just really want to reiterate, it's not over until the fat lady sings, and we are still confident that we can have a global solution on this. Because what's really at stake, actually, quite frankly, it's the whole future of the global regulatory system. Because if IMO loses control of greenhouse gas, that will be the beginning, in my view, of the IMO losing control of everything, and basically it will just be rubber stamping measures that have been decided by regional blocks, and I'm not sure that's the world that the shipping industry wants, or it's the world that the rest of the world wants, for that matter, either. Anyway, that's the end of my speech. Yeah, thank you.
Excellent, thank you very much. Very interesting viewpoints there from everybody. We had one other question. It was slightly off topic, but we'll just bring it to the forefront here, and that was on basically exhaust gas cleaning systems and how that will be involved. And it's a slightly separate regime for that, so we'll not labour the point too much. Perhaps the only relation you could think of is that with some exhaust gas cleaning systems, you have a fuel penalty of 1 to 2%. So in that way, you may increase your CO2 emissions, but the other aspects of the exhaust gas cleaning systems are off topic for this particular webinar. So
yeah, what I would just say there is it's another good example of countries acting unilaterally if they don't like the legislation that's international. You know, they'll put in restrictions in their ports, in their countries, you know, and that makes an impact here.
Yeah.
Mark, we've still got some questions in the chat bar. Yeah. There's one from RD about but when you're buying a vessel, you have to rely on the MRV data provided by the seller. I don't know if Edwin, if that's something you've come across.
Yeah, thanks, Elvin. I'm going to take a couple of questions together. So there's also a question about at EU level, which organization will be the voice of shipping companies during the negotiating process. So yes, RD, you're right that the procedure for dealing with MRV data is different from what we do in DCS. There are some amendments before us to the MRV legislation, and I can't remember all the details. And if this is not what's going to be changed for now, there is a chance to try and influence the proceedings. So if this is something that we really want as a shipping industry, for the MRV regulation to be more aligned with DCS in this regard, with regards to reporting, i.e. you don't take on the reporting of the period where you don't own the vessel, then please get in touch with your national associations, chambers of shipping, to have those discussions with their respective governments. This is, I think, really how it works in the EU. And Simon, you can feel free to chip in. But this is, I guess, democracy in action. But you need to explain the situation and the pain points to the government, so that when they negotiate at the EU level, these viewpoints can be reflected. And that is really important. Now is the time for action, not just sort of sit and watch the proceedings go. It's to get involved and make sure that the information and the insights that you have are passed up the chain.
I'll just underscore that. Yeah, it's really important you liaise with your national ship owners associations. And then in Europe, they are all members of EXA, the European Community Ship Owners Association, and they try as far as they can to produce a common position which they can represent to all of the EU institutions. And yeah, and it's this is going to be a quite a long, involved process over the next 18 months, 2 years, I would think.
I just want to make one clarification that earlier on, when sort of talking about biofuels. So what the MRV and the ETS and Fuel EU Maritime does is going to be different from how biofuels are treated in the IMO DCS system. So this is a pitfall. You just need to be very careful Now that we have a multitude of systems running around, they're not the same. And it's very easy to kind of fall into the trap of assuming that they're the same and then, realizing later that they're not. So early warning, they're not the same. They won't necessarily treat biofuels in the same way. And so while biofuels might reduce the amount of carbon allowances you might need to buy under ETS and help you that way, it doesn't necessarily at this point help you with CII or other compliance under the IMO DCS. The separate thing related to that is the cost of allowances and offsets. So earlier Alvin was talking about, so EU ETS, the carbon price is about sort of 60 euros a ton. And very often if you're in the carbon offset market trying to reduce you're trying to ship carbon neutral cargoes effectively, those prices are much lower. They're whatever, $5, $7 a ton. I've seen prices as low as $2, $3 per ton, and they're not interchangeable. However, there are some who sort of think actually you could generate carbon credits and sell them and sort of make some money that way to cover some of the cost of your ETS. This is all a huge area. It's kind of probably beyond the scope of this this webinar, but yes, there is a lot going on in that area.
Okay, thank you, everyone. Thank you, everybody. Does anybody else want to answer any of the other questions that are in, or we can always go back and clarify them afterwards, and if we need to ask for any more detail on the questions, I'm conscious that time is.
Yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah, but I'll just say one more because it's apologies if it's been answered already because it's been pretty fast paced this and it's pretty hard to keep up with the questions as they come in. There's a question here from Ichida-san. In other industries, how do they pass the liability to their clients? So what's the lessons from other industries on this? Does anyone have any thoughts on that? Any insights? So I'm afraid I don't.
So the only insight I can offer, not much, but of course, we always say shipping is a special industry, but the structure, again, we have to distinguish between the tramp sector and the liner sector. So for the liner sector, it's arguably more straightforward. They simply pass the cost on to their customers and it will increase the price of a box. And tramp shipping is much more complicated, of course, because of depending on who the charterer is. But this is our fundamental objection to the ETS. It was designed with big energy producers, cement manufacturers, these kinds of businesses in mind. It was never intended to be applied to what, for the most part, in shipping are SMEs. We know the majority of shipping companies, they're probably operating half a dozen ships, and the number of staff that you have in a typical shipping office, as you all know, is relatively small. And so this is a whole new tier of risk, guessing what carbon prices are going to be, that ship owners are going to have to grapple with. And that's the fundamental objection, which is why organisations such as the Union of Greek Ship Owners are being so vociferously opposed to this.
Okay, thank you. I'll have to be honest, I've struggled to keep up with which questions have been answered and which haven't. So I think, with this and bearing in the time and that everybody's busy, unless anybody else wants to jump in and answer another question, then we can recap the questions and follow up afterwards with an email. And if we need any clarification of persons asking the questions, we can do so just to make sure we're answering it properly. But if anybody else wants to chip in before that and before we draw a close to this, then please feel free to. No? Okay, that's great. That's we've run slightly over there. Thank you for everybody to coming along. Thank you for all the interesting questions. Like I say, we'll do a good recap afterwards and we'll look at how much of the questions have been answered. If we need any clarification, we'll contact you. We'll send over a copy of the recording once the editing process is done, hopefully within the next 48 hours. And then we'll send over a copy of the slides as well. Also, please feel free to reach out to any one of us. All our email addresses are available. We'll send that in the recap as well, just so you can, whether you need to contact anybody from North or Edwin or Simon or whoever it is, then our email addresses will be there and we can hopefully help any questions you have. So thank you to Edwin, Alvin, Simon and Helen and everybody else and all the audience for their questions. Thank you for everybody for their patience, and enjoy the rest of your day, anybody and everybody, and thank you again. Thank you very much. Thank you. Goodbye.
Thank
Bye,
you.
everyone.
Bye-bye.